Welcome, everybody. Can I first please ask everyone to mute your mic because I'm hearing a lot of background noises. Welcome, everyone, to the book launch of the Algorithmic Society, Technology, Power and Knowledge, which is hosted today by the Chair in Surveillance Studies that is located at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. I will now hand over to Rick Peters, who is Research Professor of Public Administration at the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics at Mexico City. And my name is Rosamunde van Brakel.
Thank you very much, Rosamunde. Welcome, everybody. Before starting off this session, I would like to start with a brief word of gratitude. First of all, thank you, Rosamunde, for kindly hosting this event, as well as to Bram Visser. Thank you to the people at Routledge, especially Adam Edwards, for the marvelous work they have done in helping us realize this project. And of course, many thanks to all contributors to the Algorithmic Society, the book that is. As editors, Mark and I are very excited about all chapters, and we're humbled to be surrounded by so much intellectual vigor and originality. And finally, a big thank you to our speakers today, Marlies van Eck, Rosamunde van Brakel, Michael Mcguire, and David Murakami Wood, and to everyone joining us today for the presentation of the Algorithmic Society. After the presentations by our speakers, we will have the chance, you will have the chance to pose your questions. And if you have a question, you can raise your virtual hand so I can give you the floor. Alternatively, you can also use the chat function to post your question. Please formulate your question in a concise way and indicate which of our speakers you would like to answer. We will start, however, with a brief outline of the book by my co-editor, Max Scharenburg. A brief word on Mark. He is assistant professor at the Faculty of Law of the Free University in Amsterdam. And he's working on the intersection of sociology, philosophy, and criminology. In his latest book called Hysteria, which should be out about now, also through Routledge, he examines hysteria as a contemporary social phenomenon and why it is fueled by a culture that not only abuses but also encourages and rewards it. It was a great pleasure to have co-edited the Algorithmic Society with him, one of the brightest and most original thinkers on the governance of security. Mark, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Rick. Dear all, great to see so much persons and familiar faces online. I'd like to kick off with the following. As you may know, yesterday the European Union presented a regulation on high-risk artificial intelligence systems. And this regulation provides a first glimpse of the Union's plans to tackle the governance of algorithms in the coming decades. And some of the EU proposals are very bold. The regulation includes, amongst others, a ban on AI for indiscriminate surveillance, including systems that track individuals in public spaces, a ban on artificial intelligence systems that create social credit scores, a special authorization for using what they call biometric identification systems, like facial recognition in public spaces, and for a new oversight for high-risk systems, including those that have a high chance of affecting someone's livelihood, like those used for judiciary decisions. The proposal of the EU has been hailed by some critics as ambitious, and others criticize it as disappointingly vague in key areas and say it doesn't go far enough. For instance, the descriptions of AI systems to be prohibited are vague. And also the mentioned bans will not apply to public authorities when carried out to safeguard public security. And one of the most important requirements of algorithmic systems, inclusivity, non-discrimination and fairness, is not explicitly dealt with in the proposal. Nevertheless, the proposal of the EU is a good start, as it shows that power in our society is increasingly, as sociologist Scott Lesh called it, in the algorithm. And when it comes to this technology, whether with social media sites monitoring our online life, insurance companies integrating surveillance systems inside cars, lifestyle apps providing insights about our well-being, or governmental actors who are interested in predicting and preventing risky behavior, anything goes is no longer the norm. Nevertheless, there is still some work to be done in this area. And a first step is undertaken in this new book, The Algorithmic Society, by 16 different authors. And they show that the algorithmicization of society indicates more than just the adaptation of algorithmic systems by private criminal justice. Tesla. It represents a larger transformation, how the waves of new forms of algorithmic applications not only expand the possibilities of current control, but also introduce a new set of power-knowledge relations. And whether one defines this in terms of info power, expository power, as Bernard Harcourt does, or data power, the embedded nature of algorithms and their role in all kinds of practices need to be addressed, both in terms of how algorithms create new forms of power, but also we think in the way they form their own modes of truth and subjects. Recently, this is referred to by terms such as algorithmic governance, denoting how a system of governance, which is based on the rule of the algorithm, adds new dimensions to the already existing bureaucratic, cultural, and legal systems of social ordering in our society. The main theme of the Algorithmic Society revolves around a critical concern, how algorithms are shaping society now and how they may shape it in the future. And with regard to this, algorithmic applications are anything, as we know, but morally neutral. They are laden with political values, and the use of technology has important legal, political, and social implications. In this context, scholars speak of the new Jim Code to refer how algorithms may reproduce existing inequities in our society, leading to over-policing of high poverty and non-white urban areas in the United States, for example. And to approach these concerns and moving away at the same time from dystopian views of algorithmic applications, we have asked the authors to elaborate on the following question. How can we ensure that algorithmic governance is fair and reasonable, just and unbiased? In other words, what solutions can be formulated to mitigate the negative effects or implications of algorithmic governance? And in this undertaking, we have structured the book around 3 domains. First, public administration. Second, criminal justice. And third, smart cities, in order to have a deeper understanding of the role of algorithms in our society and to an ethical and legal framework for the use of these algorithms. In the following hour, 3 authors of the Algorithmic Society will present the findings on the topics of respectively public administration, predictive policing, and the sensory experience of our urban space. In order of appearance, Marlies van Eck, Rosamunde van Brakel, and Michael Mcguire. And after their talks, David Murakami Wood will critically elaborate on their findings and conclusions. So in this way, we hope to show you today a glimpse of the ideas in the Algorithmic Society and directions for new research of the role of algorithms in our society. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for being here. And I'll pass the mic to my co-editor, Rick Peters.
Thank you very much, Mark. Welcome again to everybody who joined us in the last few minutes. We will continue with the presentation by Marlies van Eck, and she will present the main findings from her chapter, co-authored by Arjan Witlak and myself, on the quest for safeguarding principles of fairness, accountability, and proportionality in governmental automated decision-making. Marlies is consultant and a lecturer at the Faculty of Law of the Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. Her expertise is legal protection of citizens in digital government, and in her PhD thesis in 2018, she investigated automated chain decision-making by the Dutch government and the consequences it has for citizens in their legal interactions with the state. Marlies, the floor is all yours. You are muted, Alice. Maybe we should
Yes,
unmute.
of course. Yeah, thank you very much, Rick. I would like to, I have some slides and I would like to share them. Let's see. You're seeing the slides now?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Okay, so let me start properly. So our chapter is about efficiency mainly, because efficiency leads to automation. And I'm not, of course, against efficiency, because who wouldn't like to see an efficient government? If you apply for a benefit, receive the decision very quickly if you are entitled to it, and receive the money on your bank account very quickly. So efficiency, but it comes at a cost, and that's what we wrote about. Of course, I was introduced already. I work in Nijmegen. Which is, and that's always the point I make, if you remember anything of this presentation, do remember that Nijmegen is the most beautiful city of the Netherlands and the oldest, despite whatever other people will try to tell you. So that's my main giveaway for today. Our chapter is about principles of good digital administration, and I will elaborate a bit on how we came to that. If we look at the algorithmic, so the use of algorithms within the bureaucracies, especially in the Netherlands, you see that the dependence of the government seen from citizens is very high. So many people receive some benefits of the government to live their lives. So there is a high need of reallocation of money. People pay taxes, and within like a period of almost 9 months, the money that goes into the treasury is already respent on, for instance, benefits. So it's very necessary that the data are transferred and the money is transferred from one person to the agency and to citizens again. These constructions are built on data and algorithms, which they have been in place since the 70s in the Netherlands, because we have a long history of automating massive tasks in bureaucracies. And if you look at it from a legal point of view, because that's my handicap, I'm an administrative lawyer, so I try to look to this well, it's not new, to this practice from the administrative law point of view. The main task of the administration is to make money, to make not money, but to make decisions. So that's their legal core task. And what we are witnessing now is that the decision making it's either automated, so we are seeing automated decision making, or is not yet automated, but is assisted by predictions or profiling. So things we are now seeing are the predictive policing and smart cities. That's what we consider the profiling task, and the applications or your fines for speeding. Those are the automated decisions based on rule-based algorithms. And what we are seeing is that it has a very important part is the transformation from language into code. So the language of laws, it has to be transferred into code. So that's why we tend to say we are no longer living in a rule of law, but in a rule of code. Because if you want to know if you are entitled to something, yes, you can look in the legal text. But it's also it would be very good as well to look at the code. And another part of the Netherlands is that the data is reused on a very large scale. So domains don't mean anything in the Dutch legal administration tasks. So they mean things like in law, legislation, but in practice, the data that I've given to the tax administration or the insurance company gave to the tax administration will very easily end up in another process somewhere in another agency. So that's why the data is reused, and that's why we speak of network decision-making or chain decision-making. And this digital government, well, I don't have to tell you, it leads to increasing power of the government and at the same time diminishes the power of the citizens. And it's so strange to see that when they design these new infrastructures or these ideas of for instance, the principle, the once only principle, meaning that I give my data to one agency only once, and then they will make sure that the data ends up in all other relevant agencies and is as well refreshed every 24 hours. That's a very important thing, but it's based on the, well, happy flow idea that the data is always correct. And there's always a very good blueprint of reality, which of course is not always the case because we are not a package of data. So that's why it demands new arrangements. And as a lawyer, I like to base them on all traditional safeguards, so the rule of law. Why is it important? Well, these are just two shots of digital governments that make decisions that have severe consequences on the citizens. And it shows that these days, if you are a government and there are some issues with your citizens, you do well. In Russia, maybe you still need to lock them up. But in other countries, you could easily exclude them from your digital administration. And if you do so, people have no chance at all to have access to health, to have access to education, or to be able to travel. So it makes it extremely powerful, the digital government. Another part that's a very important very important in this matter is that it also has this accountability issue. It is very easy, and we witness it every day, it's very easy to say it was the system. In the Netherlands, we have all kinds of issues, and if there is an issue, for instance, in the benefit affair we have in the Netherlands, or other mistakes that were made, you can see it in the language. So the minister will tell the parliament that the system made a mistake. So while he is the political responsible and accountable person, and it were not citizens, or it were not systems that did something out of the blue, they were programmed like that. So it's very easy to say it's a glitch. Everyone will think, oh, this is too difficult for me, I don't understand it. So yes, it is probably a glitch. What they do, these algorithms, they glitch. And a film that shows how this works in society it's not a very good film, but it's Money Monster. It shows that everyone hides behind the glitch idea. The other part that we took in our chapter is street-level bureaucracy. It means it shows that the discretion and the power of the decision-making is transferred. In the old days, and we still see it in places, police officers or case handlers that make human manual decisions, those people are the street-level bureaucrats. Well, they're not always, of course, applauded for the way they work, and they experience also very high demands of society. So what you can see in the Netherlands is that, for instance, the fining of cars that are parked in ways in roads or on places that they shouldn't be parked, you see many cities buying very expensive scan cars. And the scanned cars, they drive around in the city to see if there are cars to be fined. And some cities even talk about 100%. They score 100% of fining people who did something wrong that day. That's very disturbing, because if you had a normal human being, you could say, oh, but I was just getting some groceries, or my kid is ill, please don't fine me. But now, well, of course, to other people, of course, They feel very unsafe. Well, I'm not sure if that's the reason, but it's a byproduct. So they use computers. So what happens if you have discretion in the digital government? Well, the power of the people that were once in the street had had direct interaction on the street with citizens. It shifts to IT architects and programmers. Some people say that the quants are people that can be defined similar to a mushroom. You keep them in the dark and feed them shit. I've not invented that quote. It's from an expert of the financial crisis. So if you have these quants, and I'm not offending anyone here because I can't calculate. I'm a lawyer. That's not for no reason. So I think they are doing magic, but they have no interaction with normal citizens. So they are not confronted as well with their products. Is there a problem? Well, that's something that we looked into, and we figured that there is no feedback. So you have action built on your systems. It causes effects. People are well, not happy with the side effects, for instance, but there is no feedback to the people who built or designed the system. If I would discuss this from my, I'm an administrative law person point of view, I would say there is no issue at all, because we have very, very nice formal procedures. Everyone who receives a decision can file a complaint, or I can make a formal objection. I can go to court. So in theory, everything is in place to bring back the power. And it even was, in theory, the basic idea of our legislation is that every complaint is a free advice, or sometimes it's that every complaint is a gift. So that was the theoretical idea, but we see that it doesn't bring back power, though it would be very good to detect systematic flaws. So in practice, we see there are different worlds, people who speak different languages. I as a lawyer, I had to do a lot about this as well, because that's why I was so happy to write this article, this chapter with Rick and Arjan, because they come from another academic world, another discipline. So we had to explain a lot to each other on what we mean with certain words. It leads to highly specialized functions. One of the issues, my personal issue, is that they are managed by Excel. So they are managed by public management proceedings, so based on productivity. And they are not showing any shared values on the digital government. What should a good digital government look like? That would be an easy task to fulfill if it wasn't that complex, that we are suffering with two realities in government. And we see this all the time when we discuss algorithmic society or algorithmic government. Because for one reason, if people discuss algorithms, they tend to think of machine learning and on AI, while we are focusing our chapter also on the large systems, sometimes still working with DOS in the Netherlands, that are making all the uninteresting tasks possible. So we have the future. So yes, in the Netherlands, the parliament asks questions, which is so funny, I think. They ask questions to the Minister of Justice, and they asked him, can you tell us the positive and the negative effects of Judge Dredd and Robocop? And I was thinking, this is so funny, because what's the use of asking the minister what he thinks of Hollywood scenarios? But as you may know, last week it became news that in New York they used DigiDog, this very charming, it looked to us as a very charming dog, and now it's used for surveillance activities by the police. So it was not that bad it's not a bad question. So that's on one side, we are thinking about AI, we are thinking about predictive policing, the future, robotics, which is one part of reality. And the other part is that we have severe legacy issues. If we look at the state budget in the Netherlands, 70% is spent on maintenance of ICT issues. The tax administration in the Netherlands has pleaded the cabinet of ministers for a policy period of 3 years, a policy vacation of 3 years. Please don't come up with any new legislation, any new policies. We have to keep our systems. We have to maintain the systems. We have to shut systems off. We have to build new infrastructure. So that's why it's a bit difficult to come up with simple solutions. So we don't have simple solutions. But we did have principles. What we were thinking about, if you look at the enormous amount of principles that the legislation has codified, or that one way or the other is part of our framework in Western societies, we have chosen 3 important principles, at least what we would think, seen from the Algorithmic Society. It would be the principle of due process, in meaning that it has to be possible that the computer never has the last word of the discussion. The principle of accountability. It may look like a very logical principle, but I can tell you that in the Netherlands, there are decisions made by the Dutch municipalities, and they don't know of what the decision was built upon, because they just used software. So they're using software from a company. And when a citizen asks in court, can you tell me what you based your decision upon? They can only reply with very vague comments, very vague, and they cannot tell the judge exactly what the decision was made of. So the principle of accountability is not a very, gratuit interpretation of a very important principle, and the principle of proportionality. Those were our 3 principles. And then we said we have to enhance them because of the fact that all the decisions affect one another, and the data is flown from one organization to another. So we were thinking about 3 extra parts, like procedural completeness, factual assessment. So if this is really about the computer says no, idea, does the computer says no for a reason, or just because it is built on administrative realities, and how do they conflict with real realities? And we were thinking it would be very important to have a central correction. So if the data is wrong, normally in the Netherlands, if I think my data is wrong, I have to shop and see if there is an administration willing to help me. By the way, this presentation is built on with AI, so all the symbols are built by AI in PowerPoint. So my last thank you is to Rick and Arjan, because I'm not explaining you the main ideas of the principles, but I wanted to explain to you how we came to these principles, because the background of it would be easy to just sit down and say, okay, let's see what principles are important, but we took very much into account how the daily realities are in this point. And as you may have noticed, I've added some tips or hints on nice Netflix series, because I'm a very addict on Netflix series, and at the moment I'm watching Biohackers on Netflix. It's a German series. I've added many nice series to watch that are not presented to you mainly, I think, by the algorithm. They come from different countries, not on Netflix, but when I was typing Rick and Arjan, I was just thinking about Richie and Eddie. It's definitely no offense, but I can recommend Bottom if you don't know it. And for now, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marlies. Thank you for the various recommendations. Well, I took a lot of them. In a way, I missed one specific movie, the movie I, Daniel Blake, which I think expresses very well your point about people being in the happy flow. And most people are in a happy flow, which means that not only the system designers and data analysts, but probably also most citizens won't see or experience what happens if you happen to end up on, let's say, the wrong side of the algorithm. And this is an important theme as well in a very different field where algorithms are applied, namely policing and criminal justice, where there are strong concerns about biased data causing biased decisions against already over-policed neighborhoods and population groups. And this brings us to a discussion of the role of algorithms by our dear host, Rosamunde van Brakel, who will outline her vision for a holistic framework of democratic algorithmic surveillance. Rosamunde is research professor at the Law, Science, Technology and Society Research Group, coordinating the research chair in surveillance at the Free University in Brussels. She has been studying the social and ethical consequences of surveillance technologies since 2006 already, and currently doing research on the history of the governance of surveillance and crime control in Belgium. Rosamunde, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Rick. Can you see my screen, my PowerPoint?
I can, yes.
Yes. And the next slide. So the purpose of my, first of all, I just wanted to thank everyone again for joining us today. The main goal of my chapter was to do a thought experiment. And the question I asked was, if we rethink predictive policing as democratic surveillance, what would it look like? First of all, how do I approach predictive policing? So the main assumption behind predictive policing is the idea that crime is predictable and that societal phenomena are in one way or another statistically and algorithmically calculable. We see clear echoes of 19th century positive ideas behind predictive policing. Predictive policing is a policing strategy that uses algorithmic surveillance to predict future crimes, criminal behavior, and or victims to intervene before harm occurs. Now, not everyone talks about both types. I'm going to talk about, when I'm talking about predictive policing, I'm talking about these two types of algorithmic surveillance. There's predictive mapping and there's predictive identification. And I've listed also a number of examples to show that there's at the moment lots going on for already a long time in the United States, but in Europe, increasingly predictive policing software has either been already implemented or is experimented with. So, for example, in Belgium, they are currently experimenting with predictive mapping algorithm. The big difference between the two is that predictive mapping is at an aggregate level of analysis, and predictive identification is on the individual group level, often processing personal data. In general, in Europe at the moment, the majority of applications is predictive mapping. Now, in my chapter, I show that predictive policing is undemocratic. So apart from the significant social and ethical risks, especially for vulnerable communities that have already been numerously shown in the literature, I identify 4 reasons why it's undemocratic. So the first is something Marlies already highlighted. It disempowers police officers on the ground and impacts police discretion. Power and agency are shifting towards algorithms and the companies who are developing them. The intentions and outcomes of predictive policing practices are about cost efficiency, management, and optimization, and do not focus on social justice, equity, empowerment, and care. Decisions about investing in surveillance technologies are often made top-down, being spur of the moment, just in case policies or surveillance theater, implementing the surveillance just before elections, for example, without public scrutiny or participation by citizens and police officers on the ground. There's little accountability for decision-making and no evaluations being conducted of the technologies and policies. Finally, the design of predictive policing is often the prerogative of software companies, police officers on the ground, and communities targeted by the technologies, and also other relevant actors are generally not involved in the design process. Now, I have two starting points to look how can we make algorithmic surveillance more democratic. So I start off with seeing algorithmic surveillance as social structure. So considering surveillance as social structure allows one to imagine what it could look like and points to the fact that surveillance is not fixed. So for example, in what we see happening is that CCTV cameras, for instance, are being implemented everywhere, and it seems to be no one questions if we should leave them there. It's just taken for granted that we should leave the cameras hanging there even though they're not working. It is possible both before and after implementation to imagine alternative intentions, designs, and outcomes. The process by which one set of designs rather than another comes into being is influenced by prevailing social structures and forces, including the pre-existing technological order and political negotiations or struggles. When society has habituated itself to a technology, alternatives tend to become less accessible and thought of. Here I mainly quote Richard Sclovey's book from '95, but similar ideas can be found in Bowker and Starr, who say technologies and arrangements which by design and by habit tend to fade into the woodwork, sometimes literally. My second point of departure is democratic surveillance. So this is an idea that was launched by Torin Monahan in 2010. And he says, if surveillance systems are to be designed and regulated as locally based and local accountability mechanisms, small-scale, open-ended, transparent and participatory systems, they will be inherently more democratic and less prone to abuse. The most democratic and socially empowering designs are those that work to correct power asymmetries. These are designs that explicitly intend to include social groups that have been historically marginalized or discriminated against. My idea behind democratic algorithmic surveillance is also inspired by ideas of strong democracy by Barber, who says, as a matter of justice, people should be able to influence the basic social circumstances of their lives, and also ideas of Dewey, who sees democracy as a way of life and social idea. He says each individual shall have the opportunity for release, expression, fulfillment of his distinctive capacities, and that the outcome shall further the establishment of shared values. Now, in the chapter, on the basis of these ideas on democratic surveillance and seeing surveillance as a social structure, I propose a holistic social technical framework to look at democratic algorithmic surveillance, which will help to rethink predictive policing. So in contrast with the current governing at a distance, a framework of close governance through care, empathy, empowerment, trust, and equity contrast to governance at a distance that considers the social technical embeddedness of algorithmic surveillance technologies. It explores a new democratic way of thinking about predictive policing, algorithmic surveillance, and public safety that takes into account power relations. It's inspired by concepts from positive criminology, including Mark Schuilenberg's writings on this, such as participation, care, belonging, and trust. Crime prevention policies should be shaped from the bottom up and match community needs with police needs. Finally, it implies a focus on long-term policies that will have a lasting effect instead of symbolic policing or surveillance theatre. Now, in this framework, I identify 4 intertwined levels of analysis. First, there's police practice. So here it's necessary to take seriously the impacts of corporate surveillance technologies on police officers' work and discretion. A new police professionalism is necessary that expresses values of participation, care, compassion, and empathy in their work at both management and street levels. So officers, to give an example, officers should not be promoted for making arrests, but for demonstrating how they diverted a child from prison and increased trust in the community. It implies rethinking police training, how the police are managed, and on which basis police officers are recruited. It implies rethinking current police cultures and police models, such as preemptive policing. The second level, intentions and outcomes. So in dialogue with the targeted communities, police should rethink the intentions behind predictive policing to align with a more participatory, empowering, and caring view on public safety. So instead of the intention of making management of police patrols more efficient and maybe preventing crimes, the intention could become addressing the causes of why people start committing crime and talking to communities about how public safety in their neighborhood can be improved and about their needs. This could then lead to democratic outcomes and alternative and probably often non-technological strategies. So to give an example, instead of investing in algorithmic surveillance technologies such as the gangs matrix, which is predictive policing application used by the London Metropolitan Police in the context of knife crime in London, the police could invest in projects like the Civic Information in Community project. This uses the mental model approach and explores the underlying assumptions and perspectives that shape young people's and police officials' perceptions of knife crime, safety, and trust in policing, with the goal to identify gaps, misconceptions, needs, and directions for tangible solutions. The ambition is to help re-establish trust in policing while simultaneously empowering London youth. So here's the website of this project. So it's in co-design with the youth and the police officers. And to give another example of how intentions could change, this is a recent article I found where a retiring head of the Merseyside police force says if he had £5 billion, he would spend 20% on policing and 80% on cutting poverty. So I think there's clear need to reassess intentions behind policing strategies. A third level of analysis is policy and oversight. So here, coalitions of engagement should be formed in order to create accountable and democratic technologies and police cultures. So this should be characterized by, it should be cyclical, starting from before the police invests in surveillance technology. It should include elected representatives of the police, social services, industry, civil society, academia, and affected communities. There should be democratic impact evaluations that pay attention to human rights, data protection, and social impact, and evaluates if the social technical practice is working and addresses the intentions and has the expected outcomes. It should have the power to apply enforcement measures or impose sanctions in case of non-compliance, and members of the public who sit in these bodies need to receive honorarium for their time invested. These coalitions should be complemented with regional and/or national police commissions to avoid concentrating all power at any one level of government. The fourth level of analysis is technological design. So the design of democratic predictive policing should be participatory and involve all parties, both police and the affected communities, in co-creation with the company that develops the technology. This implies they should all be engaged in diagnosing the problems and defining intentions before the design of the technology takes place. The design process should build in robust legal, ethical, technical, and social justice safeguards from the beginning, with clear evaluation criteria that are defined by the coalitions of engagement. The design process should not stop when the technology is developed. It should be seen as a design process characterized by regular evaluations and adjustments as long as the technology is implemented. Now, here's some conclusions. So in my chapter, I have shown that it is possible to rethink ways in which predictive policing can be implemented as democratic surveillance, but there are several structural issues with the proposed framework, and I think there will be more than I will discuss here, but these are the main I identify. So there are power issues, so the current political climate in many countries and also the rise of platform or surveillance capitalism will make this endeavor very difficult. The discussion about predictive policing needs to be situated within structural limits of policing and police reform. So actually rethinking predictive policing implies rethinking policing and public safety altogether. Surveillance as social structure always has the potential to coerce and disempower. So there's a risk that democratic surveillance paradoxically disempowers rather than empowers if citizens merely participate by sitting in councils and generating data while the real policy decisions are made elsewhere. And I added this is not in the chapter, but I thought with the new proposed AI regulation, I thought I would add a bit on implications of my chapter for regulation. And so implications for thinking about regulation of predictive policing. Regulation should not only focus on personal data. So the EU Law Enforcement Directive in Europe, or only focus on AI and the companies that develop AI, so the proposed AI regulation, but they also need to pay attention to the social technical practices that characterize predictive policing. And that was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosamunde, for your presentation. According to our program, we should now go to the contribution by Michael Mcguire. Unfortunately, he is facing some technical complications when trying to connect. So we hope he will be able to connect later in this session. But in order to not avoid any delays, we suggest to move on straight to the comments by David Murakami Wood, who will take up well, perhaps, we don't know actually, the themes also of the city as a democratic space. I guess what Rosamunde talked about, the idea that algorithms are taken for granted and are often hidden, also means the question, to what extent do these algorithms still invite participation? Is it possible to participate? And do they still function as an equalizer? The city as a democratic space, is this still true in an algorithmically governed city? So David Murakami Wood will provide a critical commentary to the themes outlined in the Algorithmic Society. He is an interdisciplinary scholar of city security and surveillance, working as an associate professor in the sociology department at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada. He's also founding editor and current co-editor-in-chief of the Surveillance and Society journal, and his current main research interests are around urban smartness, urban governance, and the emergence of a planetary scale surveillance society. David, over to you.
Thank you. Slightly earlier than expected, and so obviously my notes on this session are incomplete. I hope you'll beg your forgiveness on that. I have a number of points I want to make that are both based on bringing some other elements into the discussion I would want to see, but also some things that I've been listening to from two speakers so far. I should just say in advance that we're here, of course, to celebrate and to launch what is a really amazing collection, a brilliant. And nobody's mentioned so far, you're not blowing trumpets enough, that this is an exceptionally good book and everyone should go and buy it immediately afterwards. But I will say that now. So please go out and buy this book immediately after this session. Okay, now, there's a number of interesting items being brought up so far, which I will address in various different ways. The first of which I feel partly responsible in a way, because Aaron Monaghan's piece on democratizing surveillance was based on a previous publication that I had made at one of Tom's many drops in the 2000 on empowerment and surveillance. And I had actually suggested against people like Gary Marks that surveillance could be empowering. There could be forms of surveillance that could be empowering. I kind of regret that now, because I don't think that's really true anymore. And I'm actually listening to about how surveillance can be democratic surveillance, thinking I'm actually thinking that I'm wrong there. I don't think necessarily you can have anything like a democratic kind of surveillance. I'll explain why I think that might be, but I want to make it involve in some discussions. I also talk a little bit about the questions of accountability that several of people have brought up, questions of function, and various ideas about how we might evolve a critique of algorithmic society, because there's some very different bases for what we're talking about here. For example, on the one hand, we have the question of effectiveness and efficiency, which we brought up earlier. And the question here is if the question I always ask about surveillance is something that is more effective or if it fails. Is something works or if it fails. And certainly in surveillance terms, there are different kinds of effects that occur if a system is too good, or if a system is a failure. And often in Britain, where I come from, we sort of rely on fear as a de facto protection against government interference. Nothing in Britain works, right? The great things about British government is everywhere, but it works. For a long time, British people have sort of relied on this as protection of their rights. And I think this is an extremely dangerous strategy, to rely on fear to protect your rights, to rely on the failure of a policy, the failure of a system. But we still do this in many ways. But also I want to point out too that the critique it didn't work, which is a very common critique of technologies of surveillance, is never an effective or a progressive critique. Because, of course, the immediate response to this is always from the industry and from government, well, let's make it work. Let's better technology, better policy that really will work this a new kind of surveillance technology that will make it work than it used to. The answer is never get rid of the technology, or get rid of the system, or get rid of the program. As Clive Press, who Rosamund will know very well, once said, the success like failure. And in technological development, it's very much the case.
David, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm afraid the audio is a bit bad on your side. Do you have an external mic that you are able to use?
I am using an external mic. This is the professional mic I've got.
Okay. Well, if it is this is as good as it gets, then please continue. But I thought maybe there was an alternative we could use.
Part of the problem is my son is doing learning downstairs, and we have very low width here on the ILO. I could ask them to stop 10 minutes if you like. But
perhaps.
I could try.
Yes.
Let's a second.
Let's see if this works.
Is it possible we could log on 10 minutes? Seriously, I've got to give this talk and I can't talk because of the phone. Okay, this will get better now. Sorry.
Thank you, David. Sorry.
This is the world of Zoom, and I think many of us are now sick of it. It's what we've got right now. Okay, so That's one issue I wanted to bring up. The other question is the issue of trust, trust in government, but also trust in algorithms. And I think one of the I'm seeing more and more now is that, despite what we may say is critical academics, people trust algorithms in many ways. We may have critique when it comes to things like predictive policing, and people realize what's going on here. But for example, I've got students who studying opinions of the Chinese social credit system in Canada, and the population, Indigenous Canadians, think the Chinese social credit system is a very good idea. They want it to work because they think it would bring accountability to a society which is unaccountable, one which you cannot not hold people to account or trust them. And in the absence of this kind of trust, and in the present scammers and of many kinds of people, the social credit system will bring fairness, will bring accountability, and that's the word they're using is accountability to a society. So one of the things I think is, despite what the European Union new policy may believe, I believe that amongst many people, things like social credit are an extremely popular way to use algorithms in society. And we'll see more and more proposals like this that will actually be quite popular amongst people. And this is a problem. This is a big problem for us. We've got to find progressive peaks of these kinds of systems that they take account of the fact that people actually like them, are prone to liking them. That's a different kind of critique than one where we know X will be popular and we're just riding on a wave of unpopularity. It's quite a difficult thing to do. On a question too, whether these kind of potentials, but of course, you can say this is not really democracy when you have a social credit system. It's sort of algorithmic scoring system produces populations which are then managed. But in some sense, this is what people already think democracy is. I'm doing a lot of reading on the origin of neoliberalism recently, and in the original conception of neoliberalism, as produced in the Geneva School way back in the 1920s and 30s, the conception of democracy they produced was one that was based entirely on consumption and on economic participation. And I think what we see with years of neoliberalism in society is that people increasingly imagine democracy as being as much based on economic participation, financial involvement, as it is on political involvement. Of course, it's very sad. As progressives, we'd object to this, and especially in Europe, we find this completely foreign to your thinking. But in North America, this is entirely normal, right? Financial participation is already how democracy is thought of. Corporations are people. Financial involvement in democracy has been told by the Supreme Court in the USA as something that is legitimate free speech, which cannot be curtailed. So I think as the values spread through American corporations, I think we're going to see more of this pressure to understand democracy, financial stroke economic sense. And this is extremely damaging, but it's very effective if it's part of an progress to an algorithmic society. Why is this? Because fundamentally, if you think about what an algorithmic city would be, how it would function, this is going to be a city not just of ubiquitous surveillance, but of ubiquitous micropayments. The only way that such a city function in an interaction between multiple things and people all the time, we're talking not just a few hundred things here. We're talking about thousands and thousands of sensors, of devices, and people. By the way, the same thing as far as the system designers are concerned. All of these connect together. The only way you can make this function is some system of micropayments. All of these devices and people paying each other in small and ubiquitous ways all the time for interactions. And the stage is already being set for this. We're seeing ties between companies like Microsoft and MasterCard produce globally persistent identifiers that would allow for kind of systems to work. We're seeing similar tie-ups between Apple and other big financial corporations. You should watch those tie-ups very carefully because they're going to be as important as the algorithmic society, I think, as for any of the kinds of particular technologies that we're looking at. And of course, that kind of society where we're having ubiquitous micropayment, ubiquitous surveillance, it's also easy to implement a kind of a credit system on the back of that, right? Who's trustworthy, who pays, doesn't pay. So in that sense, the principle of efficiency would see the most effective surveillance society you ever imagine, and would offer a very different kind of critique. When we go back to the question of accountability in this system, we were mentioning the question of who says no, right? This old British series you may have seen, which had this as the catchphrase. And of course, back to the programmers. But when we talk about an algorithmic society, it becomes increasingly difficult just to lay blame on programmers and on the quants that people mentioned here. Many of the systems that we're developing and are developed are increasingly heuristic, that they grow and change, learn. And if we're talking about true machine learning or true AI, then we're talking about systems that in themselves have the capacity to change beyond that which was envisaged by those who create them. Now, okay, responsibility there is clearly still with people who originated them, but it becomes increasingly difficult to know why something's occurred. And even the programmers may not know. And that's, of course, hopefully is something that will be addressed through this new EU regulation. What it also means, of course, as Rosamund highlighted, is that passion disappears in everyday encounters. Carlos Llanos actually talked about this a long time ago. In 1999, 2000, there's an article in Surveillance and Society from 2004. He talked about the presence of automated socio-technical environments, as he called them, in which there was the social negotiation was possible. And I think that seemed kind of anxious at the time. It seemed difficult to imagine. But we're there now. We're there, and that's in that kind of setup now. I think that prevalence of automated socio-technical environment one we should hire. And finally, I just want to mention the idea of function creep. Somebody mentioned this in the questions as well as in the comments we've had so far. And I think function creep is only one of many forms of creep that we're now seeing in this context. Gary Mark talked many years ago about surveillance creep, but it's a rather general sort of phrase. I think there are all kinds of policy creep, function creep, payment creep, all kinds of different creeps that occur in systems, and they work together. If you like living in a society of creeps, and you can take that in several forms of that term. And finally, one thing, which is final, is the question of ethics. I'm very pleased that so far nobody has mentioned algorithmic ethics or AI. And I'm very pleased about this because it's everywhere. And I find the answer of X to the question of algorithmic society is the wrong answer to the question in that sense. Ethics is an answer to everything. AI ethics is becoming a profession. It's becoming institutionalized before we even know that it's the right kind of answer to the question I want to ask. Whenever I hear the word ethic, I want to scream politics and political economy. Because what most people want to do when they're talking about AI ethics is actually maintain or regain control in a political sense over these processes. We don't just need to train programmers to being mushrooms, as Marlies said. We need to get things involved in the political sphere, bring to light those underground magical people, the programmers in the darkness. Talk to them and have them involved in politics, but also have to have politics in what they do. So it's ethics, it's political economy, and it's politics. I think if any longer, I'll go way over my time, so I'll just leave those applications on the table. Hopefully, we'll have Michael Mcguire, if he's managed reconnect, to be able to talk to us a little bit about what he was going to talk about.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks for making that with the microphone issues. I'm not sure they've all been corrected, but thank you very much for your very interesting comments. Luckily, Michael Mcguire has also been able to join us. Welcome, Michael. Michael will discuss the way algorithms are used for the governing of our urban spaces. He is a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Surrey, and his work focuses on the study of technology crime, social control, and more recently also the culture and politics of the smart city. His recent books, Platform Criminology, out this year through Routledge, and The Laughing Police Bot, Automation and the End of Policing, develop new themes in these areas. Michael, the floor is yours. You're still muted, Michael. Still muted. Let's see, maybe.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Excellent. Yes.
Yeah. The only thing we didn't work out was I have got some slides. I don't know if we're using slides or if just talk it through, or
you can share slides, no problem at all.
I'm not sure how to do this on Teams. I usually use Zoom.
To the right top corner where it says next to the leave button, share content.
Yeah. Okay. There we go.
Then you should be able to find your screen.
There we go.
Yes, we see them.
Right, okay, so hi everyone, and thanks Mark and Rick for the invitation. It's great to be here, and even in a virtual sense. And yeah, thanks again Rick and Mark for inviting me to do a chapter in the book. I'll try and make this as brief as I possibly can, but sometimes I over-exceed my word limit, so feel free to intervene at any point and tell me when I'm talking for too long. What I wanted to talk about just very quickly in today's session, and what I spoke about in the book, was clearly we're talking about the idea of algorithmic power, and this is one of the key themes of the book. And one of the objections to the role of algorithms within smart cities, of course, is the kind of idea that this misses the human dimension of thought, intervention, action, spontaneity, all of those kinds of things. But what I think, what I wanted to talk about in the chapter was a sort of a dimension I think that is often missing from these kinds of typical objections to the smart city, which is this fundamental dimension of human experience, which is the way we engage with the world through our sense organs, the realm of the senses, you know, which Simmel brilliantly suggested a long time ago in his outline sociology, the sociology of the senses. These are the fundamental things which orient and mediate social relationships. So if that's missing from the dialogue, something I argue important is missing. So what I tried to do in the chapter was to look, first of all, at the background to sensory experience in urban spaces, and more generally how sensory experience has been managed, controlled as part of the wider control agenda that emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I wanted to show how sensory management, these projects of sensory management, which we see in traditional cities, are now entering into the smart city experience and the algorithms that are used there, and what this means for urban experience. And particularly, I wanted to look at a form of control of the sensory world, which is heavily algorithmic, and that's the technique of personalization. And I set out the outlines of an argument in the chapter that personalization actually represents a whole new kind of control approach that we need to be aware of. And then finally, I try and conclude by bringing together what that means for urban life, and for indeed the idea of, you know, what smart cities, the thing that they sell to us on is the idea of a science of the city, of an enhancement to human life through the city. And of course, this is something that long ago Aristotle and classical thinkers thought about in terms of the politeia, the science of the city. What does that mean? It's no surprise to anyone to just remind ourselves that the traditional city was a very sensory-rich environment, you know, whether it was a smellscape full of unpleasant smells like mud, decomposing animals and rotting vegetables, but also, you know, lots of very pleasant smells, you know, which you'd smell the incense coming from the church, the meadow sweet spread on the floor and the scented rushes, lavender thyme, all of these kind of smells combined together to give an incredibly rich sensory smellscape. And this is something that's actually sociologists are starting to look at smellscapes of cities as a way of interpreting their meaning. But also our other senses, whether it's touch, whether it's sound, and also to an extent the visual experience, although I'll come back to that because I think that's something that is particularly relevant today. And what has happened as the traditional city has developed is there has been a project of management of the senses, and various thinkers have pointed to important steps along the way here. So, for example, Freud spoke about the way that the sense of smell has declined can be correlated very precisely with what we think of as civilization and the rise of civilization. And Elias also, of course, spoke about the different types of rituals and habits for controlling the disgust that we experience towards certain parts of our senses. But we can also look at some of the institutional aspects to this, particularly an interesting story, which is the rise of sanitary control, auditory regulation from the 19th century onwards. And what we see is a kind of a pattern here, a sense that somehow sensory experience is too much, it's excessive, there's an overload to it, so it needs to be suppressed and controlled, sanitized. And, you know, we can look at this in terms of technologies. Technology is fundamental here. So incredibly ingenious inventions like the mechanical broom. I think I'm right in saying that's the first one, the Whitworth patent sweeping machine from the 1840s. And the whole tradition and development of, which is, as I say, an interesting story on its own, to look at how, and essentially these are algorithms for sanitization. They're not the digital algorithm, but they are input-output solutions to arrive at an agreed goal. But more recently, we look at other more interesting forms of sensory control. Through things like scented backgrounds, artificial smells, and actually a whole kind of industry that has now risen up around this, the scent consultant. And there are companies like Scent Air and Air Aroma, which claim to offer to enhance your brand identity by managing the senses in particular environments. This dynamic is something which we can see being re-articulated and refined within the smart city. And of course, this has several outcomes. One is that the environment of the smart city arguably becomes even more sanitized than where we were at the late 20th century traditional city. But what it also does is enhance the role of the algorithm as a way of controlling that. So one of the things I look at in the chapter is the sensory management systems that exist in contemporary smart cities like Singapore, where aside from the legislative controls, all kinds of heavy fines for using public toilets in the street, or for leaving waste and litter and that kind of thing, through to much more dynamic, much more complex forms of algorithmic control. And this one company I came across called Smart Clean, which has developed a very complex algorithmic control system called the Virtual Cleaning Supervisor, which is able to manage your toilet for you. You can buy their algorithmic control to help you do that, and you can detect levels of wetness, you can monitor the quality of air, you can give you feedback as well to your toilet experience if that's something you want to talk about. You can get alerts coming down to you if your toilet is not clean enough, and so on. So this is a very, very complex use of algorithms to manage sensory experience and the environment. But it's also something different that's going on here. That there is a continuity with traditional sensory control, but there's something different, and that's something I argue because the nature of sensory experience itself is changing in the contemporary world. And just as McLuhan points out, technology augments the body; it also augments the senses. And this means, and this is not the first time this has been argued, that we can actually think of more than 5 senses, sense, touch, and so on. Some people have argued that we need to think of, as well as the exteroceptive senses like touch, we can think of internal sensory experience, such as our perception of heat, our perception of time, or our sense of balance, and so on. And people like Simmel, Benjamin, De Certeau have pointed particularly how in the pre-digital world, in the 20th century technologies, the visual, the domination of the visual as a sense becomes more and more prominent. But I think we can actually go beyond even what Simmel and Benjamin and people like that say to look at what digital technology does. And it creates a kind of a second order sensory perception, which is based on information. Based on the way that digital technology codes the senses and then recodes them into environments. And we can think of this new kind of sensory experience as something which I refer to as the infosensory. But then what we see is that the snake eats its own tail. The kinds of conceptions or perceptions of sensory excess that we saw in the traditional city is reproduced in the smart city. And, the volume of information that we need to process to live in the smart city, whether it's feeds coming from our smartphones, whether it's the data that's recorded, creates a kind of a sense of pollution in the same way as traditional sensory excess did. Information noise, pollution, fake news, the overload of information that comes at us at a very, very heavy way. And we get a sense of digital anxiety, which people like McLuhan and Milgram have spoken about. So what's the solution? Again, the solution is to suppress senses. But how do you do that with information? Well, what I argue is that one of the ways in which the senses are controlled via the environment of smart cities is to reduce the kinds of sensory excess that we get to manageable levels by making information about us. by personalization, by using algorithms to, if you like, filter out the background, the complex background that we live in urban spaces, and simplify it down into a world which is just about ourselves in this kind of narcissistic sense. And you only have to look around very, very briefly to see the level of penetration that personalization is now reaching, whether it's, the simple stuff like your profile on Netflix, through to the kind of the tailored fitness apps that adapts itself to the amount of sweat that you're producing, the type of fitness experience you want, through to even mental health support through things like the Wobot counselor. And as I say, this is very much based on what other writers have spoken about in terms of the culture of narcissism in the late 20th and 21st century. And personalization works as a strategy because it makes us feel that we matter. But also, hand in hand with that comes this more subversive angle to personalization. By making us feel that we matter, it means that there is a convenient outcome for power here. It makes us more ready to comply. I mean, why would we complain about anything if the world that we live in now is all about us and tailored to our needs? And it transforms the body into, of course, into a data resource, a term that I refer as somatic harvesting. Literally, the smart city and the environment we live in now feeds upon our bodies. So political reinforcement occurs through feeding and compliance. And in this way, as I say in the article, personalization becomes the political. It's a form of digital flattery which diverts us while simultaneously absorbing us into a greater whole, which we can't even recognize anymore, let alone form any critical thoughts about. So to finish, we don't often think about smart cities as sensory environments, but I think that's a big mistake, because it's something that's always been fundamental to our experience of urban space. And one consequence of that is that algorithmic control over the sensory has been allowed to develop in the smart city and is continuing to develop. Partly this is a continuation of the modernity and the process of rationalization that we've seen in urban spaces previously, but it's also because of this new type of infosensory experience which we're exposed to, it means actually a new type of sensory control. And with this, the use of personalization algorithms which manage this, in turn creates a wholly new kind of political control. It's a control that's invisible, it's very comprehensive, it's somatic, and it generates compliance in a way which I think, should all be concerned about. That's all I'll say. That's the chapter. Thanks very much for listening. So I don't know, do I need to stop sharing now?
Yes, excellent.
Yeah.
Michael, thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting to see that the whole personalization thesis fits nicely with David's comments on the neoliberal philosophy underpinning much of the algorithmic society. We have a few minutes for a Q&A with the people who are still joining us in this session. You can raise your little virtual hand if you would like to pose a question, or use the chat alternatively. If you do, please be concise and indicate who you would like to have your question answered. While we gather some questions, maybe Rosamunde would like to briefly respond to David's comment that, well, basically he questions the very possibility of democratic surveillance.
Okay, I was expecting that to come. I think it's a question I've had writing the chapter. I mean, it was a challenge to do it because I probably lean more towards David's view on this. However, I do think what was useful of trying to rethink or trying to imagine what democratic surveillance looks like opens up possibilities and ideas that you would otherwise not think of. So I think the exercise in thinking what it could look like is not bad. And I do think, I mean, one of the things that one of my conclusions has been that if you start to rethink these practices, and start to focus on my framework, you end up with often if you would have this extreme strong democratic practices, you would end up not the communities and the police would end up not using the technology. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I'm not sure it's completely useless to rethink ways the technology can be used in this predictive sense. So one of the things I've been thinking about is, why not use these predictive analytics tools to, instead of predicting where it's more likely a burglary will take place, to predict which neighborhoods could use more investments in education, in social workers, that kind of thing. I think those applications of technologies could be interesting, at least to explore, but they are not being explored. The technologies that are being implemented are an extension of a certain type of repressive policing. So I think it's, in any case, it is a good idea to rethink the use of the technologies in different ways, because there might be some interesting applications there. But then again, what I highlighted as well is it would need a lot of safeguarding surrounding it to make sure that it is democratic, accountable, transparent. So I'm not sure this is realistic in the current climate. So.
Thank you, Rosamunde. I haven't seen any questions in the chat or raised hands so far, which, to be fair, might also be down to my limited team skills, which I will just claim as a form of resistance to algorithmic control in this time and age. But let me pose a question again for Rosamunde, because one of the things that was triggering me during rereading the various chapters is, yes, almost everyone is critical about algorithms. They personalize, dehumanize. They're hidden. They only help the happy flow. There's no garbage in, garbage out in terms of biased data and biased decision making. But we also know that humans aren't saints either. Humans also make all sorts of biased decisions, whether or not deliberately racist or from more, more subtle prejudice or other forms of bureaucratic administrative behavior. So just playing a little bit devil's advocate of my my own book here, are algorithms, or should we ask the question, are algorithms the lesser evil of the two? And aren't we holding algorithms to a way higher standard than we are human decision makers? Maybe Rosamunde, that seems to be more in line with your topic. If you would like to respond.
I can respond. So from the technologies I've been looking at in my research, so predictive policing, but also risk assessment, profiling technologies in the context of youth justice and childcare. What I'm seeing is that the interesting things are happening. So on the one hand, there's this illusion amongst policymakers that the algorithms are going to make everything objective, in contrast to the very subjective street-level bureaucrats. But in practice, what we see is, or in my research at least, is that the street-level bureaucrats are actually very critical of these algorithms and are often just not using them, or are using them in ways to influence what they want to get at. So it's irrelevant if the algorithm is as biased, more biased, less biased than the street level bureaucrat, because they'll use the algorithms in a certain way if they want in any case. So I think it's again, your question is focused on the technology, but you should look at the social technical practice to answer it. So that's also my main argument, that is also in the regulation, the sole focus always on the technology is problematic.
Thank you. Michael, I think that might provoke some comments on your side, right? This idea of personalization, which Rosamunde just brought up.
Yeah, and I think the dilemma again between what the levels of acceptability here is the real question, isn't there? But I think like all power, it's inevitable that these personalization algorithms are going to be misused. So myself, I'm quite concerned about the extent to which people are being brought into their remit under the guise of this is something that is a good thing for me and helpful for me in my life, when there's actually a lot else going on behind it.
Thank you. I see a question or comment from Arjan Witlak in the chat. Is that a question or a clarification?
I think she was asking basically Rosamund's comment about organizations versus individual discretion, and basically saying that the whole point of organizations was that we actually remove discretion to some extent to make rules that mean things function predictably. I think that's the question. But I mean, my response would be, sorry to jump here, is that organizations and societies have always depended upon discretionary application of those rules in particular circumstances. And so it's not the case that every police officer arrests someone for a crime that is committed immediately. It depends on the situation, the circumstances, and so on. But if they're told by an algorithm, then that sort of element is removed. And I think that's the key question.
Thank you. Arjan, was it a question you had or a clarification?
Well, it was an alternative answer to your question. Why, in essence, you asked why are our demands from systems so high while at the same time individuals are no saints? Well, because if we make everything dependent on the ethical attitude of individuals, well, then we have a long way to go. And in general, that is how we improve society, by using rules and technology to organize values that we deem important.
Thank you. I see we have time for one final comment or question. I see a raised hand by Marlies van Eck. You're still muted, Marlies.
Great, that gives me the opportunity to have a proper introduction. I wanted to ask a question to Michael Mcguire, because about the sense. How do you think in Eindhoven in the Netherlands, there is this lab, people who walk through the street, they don't know that they're walking through a living lab, but they're experimenting on how people behave if the lights dim down or have a nice color, but also how sense can lower the aggressiveness at certain points. So I was discussing this with my students, and actually students from mainly governments like Russia, Brazil, they were very enthusiastic because they said, okay, if you can do that, then it will protect us from police officers who run down the street and arrest everyone. So they were extremely happy to see that there maybe are other measures that can be taken to calm people down a bit more without getting hurt. For me, it was very interesting to see that. How would you see those kinds of experiments?
Yeah, that's. I mean, actually, I picked up on this this experiment in Eindhoven from something that Mark had written about. So thanks, Mark, for But I did actually mention that in the chapter, I think. Yeah, I think again, it comes down to transparency, doesn't it? I mean, I think we can experiment with human psychology and human sensory experience in all kinds of ways if there's transparency, accountability, and consensus. I don't know how. I mean, you're saying that the experiment in Eindhoven is not very well advertised, or are people aware of this when they walk down the road? Because on that basis, I would be extremely nervous about the attempt to engineer our senses to perform certain control functions. So by and large, I would think that we need to look at that very carefully before we pursue such things. They're rarely done for our benefit. Let's put it that way. It's done to, it's done to according to some agenda of control, which certain behavior, just like sensory experience, as I pointed out in the chapter, is perceived as excessive or too much. But by what criteria? By whose rules? So while I wouldn't be opposed to it, I think we need transparency and accountability in using sensory experience like that.
Rick, you're muted.
Thank you. I had that coming, I guess. It's 4:30, so we have to wrap up. I would like to thank everyone for joining us in this book presentation of the Algorithmic Society. If my co-editor could hold up the book so people will see what it looks like. And it should be in shops online through Routledge. Thank you, David. Thank you, Marlies. Thank you, Rosamunde. Thank you, Michael, for your very interesting presentations. I would like to give a final word to Rosamunde, our kind host today, for a brief wrap-up of today's session.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. This is the first book launch we organized in the context of the Chair in Surveillance Studies at the VUB. We have a seminar series on surveillance that is going on, and we'll have 2 more seminars before the summer. So if you're interested, please join us. Again, on the next one will be on policing and surveillance with Professor Elizabeth Joe. And I just wanted to thank Rick and Mark for editing such a wonderful book. And I want to thank Bram Visser, who organized this session, for his good work. And I want to thank Marlies, David, and Michael for joining us today as well. And I hope to see everyone again at a certain point. Thank you.